Throughout the corridors of history, one truth echoes with chilling consistency: whoever controls the money controls the world. Not armies. Not borders. Not even ideology. Money. The lifeblood of civilization, the invisible chain that binds nations to their fate. And every empire that has risen to dominate the known world has eventually learned the same brutal lesson, that the power to create currency is also the power to destroy everything you've built. It's a pattern as old as coined metal itself, a cycle that repeats with mathematical precision across millennia. The players change. The costumes evolve. But the play remains the same. We stand today at what may be the most consequential monetary crossroads in human history. The old order, cash, physical currencies, the anonymous transaction, is being dismantled piece by piece. In its place, something new is rising from the laboratories of central banks and the conference rooms of global institutions. They call it a central bank digital currency. CBDC. A programmable monetary system where every transaction is tracked, every purchase can be approved or denied, and money itself has an expiration date. It sounds like science fiction. It is not. It is being built right now, in the shadows of institutions like the Bank for International Settlements, the Central Bank for Central Banks, housed in a tower in Basel, Switzerland. But before we peer into this digital abyss, we must understand the pattern. We must examine how previous empires wielded monetary control, how they corrupted it, and how that corruption led inexorably to their downfall. We will trace this pattern through three historical case studies: the Roman Empire's debasement of the denarius, the Weimar Republic's descent into hyperinflationary madness, and the dissolution of the Bretton Woods system that ended America's gold standard. Each represents a different era, a different mechanism of collapse. But the underlying disease is identical: the arrogance of believing you can manipulate the fundamental laws of economic reality without consequence. The question is not whether the pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The question is whether we will recognize it in time. Rome at its zenith was not merely an empire. It was the concept of civilization itself, carved in marble and enforced with iron. By the reign of Trajan in the early 2nd century, Roman legions had pushed the boundaries of the known world to their absolute limits, from the cold mists of Britain to the scorching deserts of Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Euphrates. Nearly a quarter of the world's population lived under Roman law. The Mediterranean was a Roman lake, so secure that pirates had been hunted to extinction. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, stretched across millions of square kilometers, enabling trade on a scale never before seen in human history. And at the heart of this magnificent machine beat the denarius. This small silver coin, roughly 95% pure silver at its introduction, was the dollar of its age. It paid the legions. It lubricated commerce from Londinium to Jerusalem. It was trusted implicitly because it represented real value, actual precious metal that could be melted, weighed, and verified. Roman merchants didn't need to trust the emperor's decree, they could trust the metal itself. This monetary stability was Rome's secret weapon, more powerful than its famed legions. It allowed the empire to maintain a professional standing army, to build infrastructure that still stands 2 millennia later, and to project power across 3 continents simultaneously. The denarius was Rome's guarantee of eternal dominance. But empires, like men, grow arrogant in their strength. The rot began subtly, as all great catastrophes do. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, faced a problem that would haunt every subsequent ruler: the empire had become too expensive to maintain. The legions demanded their pay. The borders required constant reinforcement. Barbarian incursions grew more frequent and more organized. The cost of defense spiraled upward while the productivity of the empire stagnated. The answer seemed simple: if you need more money, make more money. But Rome had no printing press. What it had was something far more insidious: the power to debase the currency. In 193 CE, Emperor Septimius Severus reduced the silver content of the denarius from 87% to 81%. The difference was made up with base metals, copper, bronze, whatever was at hand. The coins looked the same. They bore the emperor's face. But they were lies wrapped in a thin veneer of silver. And like all lies, this one demanded more lies to sustain it. Caracalla reduced it further to 50%. By the time the crisis of the 3rd century struck, emperors were churning out coins that contained less than 5% silver. They had discovered the intoxicating power of monetary manipulation, the ability to conjure wealth from nothing, to pay debts with worthless metal stamped with imperial authority. The immediate effect was euphoric. More coins meant more money to pay soldiers, to bribe potential rebels, to fund lavish building projects. But Gresham's law, that bad money drives out good, is not a suggestion. It is an iron law of economics. Citizens began hoarding the old, high-quality denarii and spending only the debased ones. Merchants raised prices to account for the worthless currency. What began as a 2% inflation rate exploded into a death spiral. By the mid-3rd century, prices had increased by over 5,000%. The army, once Rome's greatest strength, became a parasitic force, demanding ever higher pay in ever worthless coins. Soldiers murdered emperors who couldn't meet their demands. In 50 years, 26 emperors ruled Rome. Most died violently. The monetary collapse triggered a cascade of failures that nearly destroyed Rome entirely. Trade networks disintegrated as merchants refused to accept Roman currency. Provinces began reverting to barter systems or minting their own local coinages. The sophisticated money-based economy that had enabled Rome's grandeur contracted into something medieval. Tax collection became impossible because the currency was worthless, the state couldn't pay for its own administration. The legions, unpaid or paid in garbage currency, began looting the very provinces they were supposed to protect. Germanic tribes, sensing weakness, intensified their raids. The empire fractured into competing zones of control. Diocletian, who seized power in 284 CE, attempted to fix the broken system through brute force, price controls, capital punishment for merchants who raised prices, mandatory occupations. It failed. You cannot legislate away economic reality. His successor, Constantine, took a different approach. He abandoned the denarius entirely and introduced the solidus, a gold coin of fixed weight and purity. It worked, but only because Constantine understood what his predecessors had forgotten, that money must represent real value, not imperial decree. But the damage was done. Rome survived, transformed into the Byzantine Empire in the east, but in the west it had lost its economic foundation. The sophisticated monetary economy that had united the Mediterranean world was gone. When the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed in 476 CE, it was not conquered so much as it simply ceased to function. The Visigoths who sacked Rome in 410 found an empire already dead from within, killed by the arrogance of emperors who believed they could manipulate the fundamental nature of money without consequence. The lesson was written in the ruins: debase the currency, destroy the empire. Fast forward 13 centuries. The empires have changed, the weapons have evolved, but the pattern remains dormant, waiting to spring its trap once more. Post-World War I Germany was not Rome, but it faced a strikingly similar dilemma: crippling debts it could not pay, a shattered economy, and enemies demanding tribute. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed reparations of 132 billion gold marks, a sum so astronomical that it would take Germany until 1988 to pay. This was not merely punishment, it was designed to ensure Germany could never rise again. The French wanted their revenge served cold, calculated in gold marks and delivered in coal, steel, and national humiliation. The Weimar Republic, Germany's fragile democracy, inherited this poisoned chalice. The economy was in ruins. Industrial production had collapsed. The labor force was decimated by war casualties. Returning soldiers flooded the streets, jobless and angry. And every 3 months, another reparation payment came due. The options were stark: default and face military occupation, or find a way to generate the money. Since raising taxes on a prostrate population was political suicide and borrowing from foreign banks was impossible, the Weimar government chose the third path, the same path Rome had chosen 2 millennia earlier. They would simply print the money they needed. In 1919, the exchange rate was 12 marks to the dollar. The printing presses began to hum. What began as a seemingly rational response to an impossible situation metastasized into one of the most spectacular economic catastrophes in human history. The Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, started printing currency to buy foreign exchange to pay the reparations. More paper marks flooded the economy. Prices began to rise. Workers demanded higher wages to afford bread. Businesses raised prices to cover the higher wages. The government printed more money to pay civil servants and subsidize industries. It was a feedback loop with only one possible ending, but like Rome before it, the architects of this disaster convinced themselves they could control forces that respected no human authority. By 1922, the exchange rate had deteriorated to 7,400 marks to the dollar. Still manageable, they told themselves. By January 1923, it was 18,000 to the dollar. By July, 350,000 to the dollar. By November 1923, just 10 months later, it took 4.2 trillion marks to buy a single dollar. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 cost 200 billion marks by November. The price of bread could double overnight. Workers were paid twice a day so they could rush out and buy something, anything, before their wages became worthless. People carted money in wheelbarrows. Children built towers with stacks of million-mark notes because the paper was worth more as kindling than as currency. The middle class, the backbone of any stable society, was wiped out. Life savings vanished. Pensions became jokes. This was not mere inflation. This was the complete destruction of money as a concept. In a hyperinflationary collapse, the currency doesn't just lose value, it loses meaning. It becomes a cruel parody of itself, a bitter reminder that all the promises printed on those notes, backed by the German Reich, were lies. And when money becomes meaningless, civilization itself begins to fray. The economic catastrophe birthed political monsters. The Weimar Republic's credibility was shattered. Germans looked at their democratic government and saw only incompetence and betrayal. In Munich, a failed artist and war veteran named Adolf Hitler attempted a coup in November 1923, riding a wave of rage at the economic humiliation. He failed, this time. But he had learned a crucial lesson: desperate people are willing to embrace anyone who promises to restore order and national pride, regardless of the cost. The hyperinflation was finally stopped in late 1923 by introducing the Rentenmark, a new currency backed not by gold but by land and industrial assets. It worked because it represented something real, something that couldn't be printed into oblivion. The economy stabilized, but German society never fully recovered. The psychological scars ran too deep. The middle class that had seen their wealth evaporated learned to distrust democratic institutions, to view the liberal international order as a rigged game designed to humiliate Germany. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, it took only 4 years for the Nazi Party to seize power. The straight line from the printing presses of 1923 to the ovens of Auschwitz is shorter than most care to admit. As in Rome, the pattern held. A government facing impossible debts chose the path of monetary manipulation. It bought temporary relief at the cost of permanent destruction. The currency was sacrificed on the altar of political convenience, and an entire civilization paid the price. July 1944. While armies were still dying on the beaches of Normandy and in the Pacific Islands, representatives from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their mission: design the monetary architecture for the post-war world. The British, represented by the brilliant economist John Maynard Keynes, proposed an international currency, the Bancor, that no single nation could manipulate. The Americans, represented by Harry Dexter White, had a simpler idea: the dollar would be as good as gold, fixed at $35 per ounce, and every other currency would peg itself to the dollar. The United States held 70% of the world's gold reserves. It was the only major economy whose infrastructure hadn't been reduced to rubble. The choice was not really a choice at all. The Bretton Woods system made the dollar the world's reserve currency. Oil would be priced in dollars. International debts would be settled in dollars. But crucially, those dollars were backed by gold. Any nation could, in theory, exchange their dollars for gold at the fixed rate. This was the promise that gave the system credibility. The dollar was not just an American currency, it was a global public good, as reliable as the metal itself. For 2 decades, it worked beautifully. The post-war economic boom was built on this foundation of monetary stability. But the pattern does not sleep. By the 1960s, the United States faced its own impossible choice, the same choice that had destroyed Rome and Weimar. President Lyndon Johnson wanted to build the Great Society, a massive expansion of social programs, while simultaneously fighting the Vietnam War. Guns and butter, they called it, total war on poverty at home and communism abroad. The cost was astronomical. Tax increases were politically toxic. Cutting spending was unacceptable. So the Federal Reserve did what central banks do when faced with unlimited demands and limited resources: it created more dollars. But there was a problem. Under Bretton Woods, those dollars were supposed to be backed by gold. The United States was printing more currency than it had gold to support. Other nations, particularly France under Charles de Gaulle, who despised American hegemony, began to notice. They started converting their dollars to gold and shipping it back to Fort Knox. By 1971, the gold reserves were hemorrhaging. The world was starting to call America's bluff. The choice was stark: either slash spending, end the Vietnam War, raise taxes, and watch the economy crater, or break the promise. Admit that the dollar was no longer backed by gold. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon appeared on television and announced that the United States was, temporarily, suspending the convertibility of dollars to gold. He used words like necessary and protecting American interests. What he meant was simple: we're out of gold, we refuse to stop spending, so the promise is dead. It was called the Nixon shock, and it reverberated across the global economy like an earthquake. The fixed exchange rate system collapsed. Currencies began to float against each other. And for the first time in history, the world's reserve currency was backed by nothing except the full faith and credit of the issuing government, which is to say, by trust alone. This was the birth of the true fiat currency era. Money was now entirely abstract, divorced from any physical commodity. Its value derived purely from collective agreement and governmental decree. And here is where our story takes a darker turn, where the historical pattern intersects with the digital future. Because if money can be created with the stroke of a pen or the click of a computer key, if its value is purely a social construct enforced by law, then what is to stop those who control it from engineering it to their exact specifications? What is to stop them from making it programmable? 3 times we have witnessed the same play performed on history's stage. Rome debasing the denarius. Weimar printing marks into worthlessness. America severing the dollar from gold. Each time, the same pattern: a power facing impossible demands chooses to manipulate the currency rather than confront hard choices. Each time, the immediate crisis is deferred at the cost of long-term catastrophe. Each time, the architects of destruction convinced themselves they were the exception to the rule. And now we arrive at the present moment, where the curtain is rising on Act 4. The institutions of global finance, the Bank for International Settlements, the central banks, the World Economic Forum, are not hiding their intentions. They speak openly of the Great Reset, of redesigning capitalism, of stakeholder economics. At the center of this vision lies the CBDC, a digital currency that exists only in databases, tracked in real time, programmable down to the individual transaction. They promise efficiency. They promise security. They promise an end to financial crime and tax evasion. But strip away the rhetoric, and what emerges is something far more profound and terrifying: the complete and total control of money, and through money, of human behavior itself. A CBDC can be designed with an expiration date, use it or lose it, forcing consumption and eliminating savings. It can restrict what you purchase: no tobacco, no gasoline, no meat if your carbon footprint is too high. It can be frozen remotely if you are deemed a threat, turning political dissidents into economic ghosts with a keystroke. This is not speculation. These features are being discussed in policy papers and central bank white papers. The technology exists. The infrastructure is being built. And here is the dark genius of the pattern repeating itself in digital form. Unlike the debasement of Roman coins or the printing of Weimar marks, a CBDC collapse would be instant and global. There would be no physical currency to fall back on. No gold coins buried in the garden. No black market barter system. Just zeros in a database, and the people who control that database would have more power than any emperor, dictator, or king in human history. They would control not just the money supply, but every transaction, every purchase, every economic interaction. The surveillance state and the monetary system would merge into a single, all-seeing apparatus. The question facing our civilization is not whether those with power will attempt to implement this system; they are already doing so. The question is whether enough people will recognize the pattern before it's too late. Rome didn't see the danger until the denarius was worthless. Weimar didn't see it until a wheelbarrow of marks couldn't buy bread. America didn't see it until the gold was gone. What will we fail to see until the trap has already closed? History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And if you listen carefully, you can hear the rhyme scheme forming now. A crisis is coming, another pandemic, a climate catastrophe, a financial meltdown, it doesn't matter which. The crisis will be used to justify emergency measures. The emergency measures will include the rapid implementation of CBDCs, for our own protection. And by the time people realize what has been lost, the old system of anonymous cash and financial privacy will be as dead as the Roman denarius. You cannot rebel against a system that can turn off your ability to buy food. Perhaps the greatest irony is this: the hacker in our opening scenario, the one who broke into the BIS servers and found the prototype, faces an impossible choice that mirrors the choice faced by every emperor, every chancellor, every president who has ever possessed the power to create money from nothing. She can release the code and expose the plan, but that code contains vulnerabilities that could crash the existing financial system before the CBDC is ready, causing untold chaos and suffering. Or she can stay silent, allowing a dystopian monetary system to be implemented under the guise of safety and efficiency. There are no good options. There never are when you're trapped inside a historical pattern that has been playing out for 2,000 years. The only real choice is whether we will learn from the past, or whether we will insist on experiencing the catastrophe for ourselves. The architects of the CBDC system believe they are different, that their technology is sophisticated enough to avoid the mistakes of Rome, Weimar, and Bretton Woods. They believe they can control variables that have destroyed empires. History is waiting to deliver its verdict. It always does.